Hey, everybody. We are moving on to our next type of poem, which is the ode. So, what is an ode? An ode is a short poem in praise of a person or of an object. Odes are lyric poems, which means they express the feelings and emotions of the poet. They often have a regular meter and rhyme scheme, though not always. Some important terms to remember about odes are rhyme scheme. Remember, a rhyme scheme is a set pattern of rhyme. Letters are assigned to each line of the poem according to the rhyme scheme. Rhythm, this is the recurrence of stressed and unstressed syllables that creates a sort of beat to the poem. Meter, this is the repetition of a regular rhythmic unit in a line of poetry. In other words, it's a set rhythm that you expect to get in each line. A poetic foot is an individual unit of meter. So a poetic foot is either 2 or 3 syllables. And I'm going to show you some examples. I'll signify the stressed syllables with the forward slash and the unstressed with the letter U. So the first type of poetic foot is a 2-syllable foot, and it's iambic. It begins with an unstressed syllable and then with a stressed. Desert is an example of an iambic foot. We put the stress on the second part of the word. A trochaic foot is the opposite. This is where the stressed syllable comes first. Desert. So you can hear the difference between dessert, which is iambic, and desert, which is trochaic. The third type of foot is anapestic. This is where we have 2 unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable. Understand. A dactylic is the opposite. It is 1 stressed syllable followed by 2 unstressed. Bicycle. The last poetic foot is the spondaic foot, which is when you put an equal stress on both syllables, such as ice cream. To scan a line of poetry is to describe the meter of the poem by identifying the number and the type of feet per line. Monometer means that there's 1 foot per line, so each line would have 2 to 3 syllables. Dimeter means 2 feet per line, so 2 iambs or 2 trochees, etc. Trimeter is 3 feet per line. Tetrameter is 4 feet per line. Pentameter is 5 feet per line, and so on. We could keep moving forward with the number of feet per line. But let's look at an example of pentameter. So pentameter has 5 lines, 5 poetic feet in each line. So 5 patterns of syllables here. I am, a pie, writ with, a wooden leg. This is called iambic pentameter because we have 5 units, 5 feet, and each of those feet are iambs. Just to remind you from the previous slide, an iamb is an unstressed and then a stressed syllable. Some other important terms to remember when we're talking about odes are metaphors and similes. When you're writing in praise of a person or an object, you might compare that person or object to something in a flattering way. So writers of odes really rely on metaphors and similes. They also personify the object that they are in praise of. They might give it human characteristics. Obviously, poems contain imagery, so we can visualize what the poet is describing. Hyperbole, as in large exaggerations, and also an exaggerated tone of praise. In an ode, you are really going all out to show your appreciation or love of something. Repetition. Some odes contain irony. Some odes also contain allusions where they reference other works of literature or songs. Modern odes might even reference celebrities or other things from pop culture that they would expect the reader to be familiar with. Symbolism. Sound devices such as alliteration, which was repeating of consonant sounds at the beginning of words, and assonance, which is the repeating of vowel sounds within words. Probably the most important literary term, however, for odes is apostrophe. And this isn't talking about the punctuation symbol apostrophe. An apostrophe in literature is a speech or an address to a person who is not present or to a personified object. So the poet is essentially turning to this person or object that is not actually there at the moment and addressing it. Some other important terms to remember when it comes to odes are stanzas. Remember, a stanza is a section of lines in a poem, almost like a poem's paragraph. A couplet is a 2-line stanza. A quatrain is a 4-line stanza. But there are also any combinations, and they all have their own name. So a tercet would be a 3-line stanza. A quintain would be a 5-line stanza. A sestet would be a 6-line stanza, etc. So there are 3 main types of odes, 2 classic types and 1 more modern type. The first type is the Pindaric mode. This ode was named after an ancient Greek poet, Pindar, who began writing choral poems that were meant to be sung at public events. So Pindar wrote these poems. They might be in praise of a military battle, of a public figure, of one of the Greek deities or gods. The Pindaric odes have a set structure. They begin with something called the strophe, then they move on to the antistrophe, and then to the epode, with irregular rhyme patterns and lengths of lines. So there isn't any regular rhyme pattern or length of line, but they do contain these 3 sections. So the strophe sets up the problem or argument. The antistrophe replies to the problem or argument in some way. And the epode is the final stanza that sums up the poem and communicates its theme. So let's look at a sample Pindaric poem. This poem was written in the Pindaric fashion, but it was actually written during the Renaissance. This is translated from the French. So the title of the poem is To His Young Mistress. The first part is the strophe, where we set up the argument or the problem. Fair flower of 15 springs, that still art scarcely blossomed from the bud, yet hast such store of evil will, a heart so full of hardihood, seeking to hide in friendly wise the mischief of your mocking eyes. So this is a young man talking to his young mistress. She's 15 years old, fair flower of 15 springs. It says that she art scarcely blossomed from the bud. So she's just come into adolescence, and she has blossomed into a beautiful young woman. He uses the metaphor of the flower to describe her. And then he continues that metaphor in the second line when he talks about being blossomed from the bud. So she's this beautiful flower, yet the word yet signifies that we have a turn here. Yet has such store of evil will. She's evil. She's out to do evil. A heart so full of hardihood. So she's hard-hearted. She seeks to hide in friendly wise. So she seems friendly, the mischief of your mocking eyes. So she is mocking him in some way. He doesn't appreciate the way that she is treating him. Even though she's young, she's already figured out how to manipulate this relationship. So that's the strophe where we set up the problem. The second part is the antistrophe, where we get another kind of angle of the problem. If you have pity, child, give o'er, or give over. Give back the heart you stole from me. Pirate, setting so little store on this your captive from love's sea, holding his misery for gain and making pleasure of his pain. So now we're getting another angle. The first part was about her, and now the second part here, the antistrophe, is more about him and how he's feeling. He's asking her to have pity on him and to give him back his heart that she stole. So she stole his heart. He again provides a metaphor for her. He calls her a pirate. So thinking about a pirate who steals something that doesn't belong to them and doesn't really show any mercy. And he calls himself a captive from love's sea. So we've got a lot of metaphorical language here. Holding his misery for gain, like she's getting something out of stringing him along or manipulating him. She's getting pleasure of seeing him suffer. Maybe she's flirting with a bunch of other guys too. Who knows? And then we get the epode, where we get the theme of the poem. Another, not so fair of face, but far more pitiful than you, would take my heart if of his grace my heart would give her of love's due. And she shall have it, since I find that you are cruel and unkind. So the poem wraps up basically with him saying that he's going to find another girl. Maybe she won't be as pretty as this girl, but she'll have more pity for him. So pitiful here, it doesn't mean how we would say this word today or use this word today. Pitiful doesn't mean pathetic. Pitiful means here like showing pity. If she's somebody who will show me pity and not be so mean to me. If I could give her my heart, she would take it. And she can have it. Because you are so mean to me, I'm going to give my heart to someone else. So this kind of sums up the theme of it. I'm leaving you. You're too mean. So that's an example of a Pindaric ode. Another type of ode is the Homeric ode. The name of this ode was taken from the Latin poet Horace. Unlike heroic odes of Pindar, Horatian odes are informal, meditative, and intimate. These odes dwelled on interesting subject matters that were simple and were pleasing to the senses. Since Horatian odes are informal in tone, they are devoid of any strict rules. However, they're usually composed in 2 to 4 line stanzas. So a Horatian ode might not follow any set meter, but it probably will have some sort of rhyme, some sort of set scheme, but it's up to the poet. So let's look at an example. This poem is called The Ship of State. Now, the ship of state is a metaphor for the government. If you've ever heard anyone on TV or on the news talk about the ship of state, they're talking about the American government or a government. Now, Horace was Roman, so obviously he would be talking about the Roman government. So he immediately turns and begins talking to the ship of state. Keep in mind that he's actually talking about the government. On ship, new billows sweep thee out, seaward. What will thou? Hold the port, be stout. Seest not thy mast how rent by stiff southwestern blast? So let's stop here and talk about what this is actually saying. He says, on ship. So he's saying, government, go forth. New billows sweep thee out, seaward. Sorry, I need to read that all together. New billows sweep thee out seaward. So you are being taken out to sea by different types of winds. Just like the government has to deal with lots of different types of problems. What wilt thou? What are you going to do? He says, hold the port, be stout. Okay, so he's saying, keep going. Even though try not to see that your mast, which is the ship, the mast of the ship, is rent by stiff southwestern blasts. So keep going, even though things are getting rough and hard. At the government level, we need to keep going. We need to keep focused, moving ahead. But he uses the metaphor of a ship. Now, you think about on a ship, you have lots of different types of people working on the ship and lots of different parts to the ship that have to work together the same way as a government would. Thy side of rowers, how forlorn! Thine hull with groaning yards, with rigging torn, can ill sustain the fierce and ever fiercer main. Now, I've only given you a portion of the poem here, but he talks about how the rowers are forlorn. So the people who operate within this government are getting down. Forlorn means sad. They're getting down. They're getting worn down. They're groaning. The rigging of the ship is torn, so that would be like the ropes and the sails and all of that is torn. Maybe they're having to operate with not great materials or tools, resources. So they're really feeling down. Then the poem goes on to talk more about, his theme, which is to keep going. If you notice that this poem is in quatrains, so it's in 4-line stanzas, and it does have a set rhyme scheme, but it is up to the poet to determine the rhyme scheme. And he has done an AABB rhyme scheme. And then in the next stanza, he begins the new rhyme, CCDD. So basically, these are two sets of rhyming couplets that make a quatrain. The next type of ode is an irregular ode. This type of ode is without any formal rhyme scheme and structure, such as the Pindaric ode. Hence, the poet has great freedom and flexibility to try any types of concepts and moods. So, any rhyme scheme, any structure that the poet wants to take. However, the poet usually does decide on some set rhythm or rhyme scheme. They just get to decide what it's going to be. William Wordsworth was a poet during the 1800s, late 1700s, in England, as was John Keats, and they wrote irregular odes and are very famous for those. So we're going to look at one of John Keats' odes. This one is called Ode on a Grecian Urn. Now, basically, Keats was studying and looking at this ancient Greek pottery that had a scene painted on it, and it had a scene of basically women being chased around a garden or something like that by either a man or a god. And so he's looking at this and he's thinking about, what is the story behind this urn? He doesn't know what the story is. Obviously, the Greeks have used this urn to record either a story from Greek legends or a Greek myth. So this poem is him admiring this urn, this piece of pottery, and thinking about what the picture could possibly be about. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme? So I'm going to stop there and let's talk about the first part. So he provides 3 metaphors for the urn itself, for the piece of pottery. He calls the piece of pottery the bride of quietness, so it's just sitting there quietly. It can't speak and tell him what the story is. He calls it the foster child of silence and slow time. He also calls it the sylvan historian. Sylvan just means like something from nature or the countryside. So he calls it a historian. It's recording history here. And he says, he compliments this urn. He says that you can express your tale better than the poets can through rhyme. That this pottery, this picture on the pottery is expressing something more clearly than a poem could. On to the next part. What leaf-ringed legend haunts about thy shape? Of deities or mortals, or of both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady? So he's asking, what legend is painted around you? Is it about deities, gods, or is it about mortals, or is it about both? Are they in the temple? or in the dales of Arcady. Now, Arcady was a area in Greece, so he's making an allusion to ancient Greece there in this poem. What men or gods are these? What maidens loath? Loath means resisting. The maidens are running away. What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and trembles? What wild ecstasy? So he's questioning this urn that he's admiring. Tell me your story, urn, but it can't because it is, silent. It's just an object. But he's admiring it, and it's making him want to know. So that's an example of an irregular mode. You can see Keats has his own rhyme scheme here that he created. A, B, A, B, C, D, E, D, C, E. So it's kind of interesting. He does 2 couplets in a row. And then he does this where he inverts the lines, C, D, E, D, C, E. Kind of rearranges them, but the same rhymes keep popping up. The other thing is, this poem is written in iambic pentameter, which means that it's composed of 5, each line of the poem is composed of 5 iambs. So 5 groups of unstressed, stressed syllables. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thy foster child of silence and slow time. So it has that iambic pentameter. It has its own meter, but that's just because Keats chose to write it in that meter. It's not required for an irregular ode. The poet gets to decide how to structure it. There are also modern odes. Let's look at one. This one is called Ode to Pablo's Tennis Shoes. Now you'll notice with this one, it does not have a set rhyme scheme or rhythm, but it does use metaphors, similes, and personification. They wait under Pablo's bed, rain-beaten, sun-beaten, a scuff of green at their tips from when he fell in the schoolyard. He fell leaping for a football that sailed his way, but Pablo fell and got up, green on his shoes with the football out of reach. Now it's night. Pablo is in bed listening to his mother laughing to the Mexican novellas on TV. His shoes, twin pets that snuggle his toes, are under the bed. He should have bathed, but he didn't. Dirt rolls from his palm, blades of grass tumble from his hair. He wants to be like his shoes, a little dirty from the road, a little worn from racing to the drinking fountain 100 times in one day. It takes water to make him go, and his shoes get him there. He loves his shoes, cloth like a sail, rubber like a lifeboat on a rough sea. Pablo is tired, sinking into the mattress, his eyes sting from grass and long words in books. He needs 8 hours of sleep to cool his shoes, the tongues hanging out, exhausted. So we have some comparisons. He compares the shoes to some different things. He compares his shoes to cloth like a sail, rubber like a lifeboat on a rough sea. So his shoes, he compares them to a boat taking him over rough places. He also later, the shoes are personified, says that their tongues are hanging out exhausted. And you think about the tongue part of a tennis shoe, you can just see that like hanging out exhausted. That's really effective personification of his shoes to show that they're worn out from all the running that this kid does during the day. So there's a lot of imagery here. We can really see this kid. We can hear his mother laughing. We can visualize him, the dirt rolls from his palms, blades of grass from his hair. So there's a lot of great imagery in this poem, and there's personification and similes as well. Okay, I'm going to show you one more modern ode, and you have a question to answer on your Flipgrid about this ode. This one is called An Ode to Coffee. And in your Flipgrid, which I'll post the link here in just a second, I would like for you to answer the question, what are 3 characteristics of an ode that you see or hear in this poem, Ode to Coffee? And be specific in your answers. So try to give specific lines. That might require listening to the poem a couple of times. It's only a little over a minute long.
Sweet coffee, I adore thee. adrenaline of my days. I hope the day will never come when you and I part ways. Without you, I'd be useless, perpetually sedated. I can't imagine doing a thing if I were not caffeinated. Warm liquid of my better self, of my soul and heart. The bliss I know in a cup of joe, we will never part. I sip you while I'm driving. If I'm stopped or if I'm merging, the urge I have for you, sweet cup, is forever surging. Warmer than Bermuda, more soothing than the Cape. You're on the counter in my hand, you simply cannot escape. Before you, my mind is sleeping. I'm really catatonic. Daily you revive me, oh caffeinated tonic. Sweeter than the autumn breeze coming from the west. Of all the liquids known to man, I love thee the best. I will not drink a can of beer or a glass of wine. All I need is coffee. I am yours, and you are mine. I hope the day will never come when you and I part ways. Sweet coffee, I adore thee. Adrenaline of my days. Carl Stevens, WBC News Radio, 1030.